the land upon which I work and live on, which are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Australia. Yep. Just a quick reminder that this is going to be recorded. So if you'd rather not be captured, just make sure your cameras are off. You can put any questions you like in chat because chat is not captured. I'll just remind everyone to make sure that you are on mute. And we're going to have a great presentation today from Kevin Martin, who's the head arborist of tree collections at the Kew Royal Botanic Gardens in the United Kingdom. Just a reminder again, if everyone, you could please mute yourselves. Kevin, feel free to dive in and take it away.
Great. Thank you, everyone. So let me just share my screen. There we go. So what I'm going to be discussing today started off as a research project, which I did at Lancaster University, where I'm an associate researcher as a master's student. It was a research master's, and basically I wanted to come up with a better way at trying to understand the potential impact of climate change on our living landscape here at Kew, and that's really where this work has started. So if we think about it, this is the reality. So we know, especially in the UK, that our climate is shifting extremely quickly now, and we often talk about August of 2022. That's because it was so significant in a drought and a heat wave. We had some places in the UK that went over 40 degrees, which is really, really phenomenal here in the UK. And often when people think of the UK around the world, they think of a cold, wet summer, and it's not very, very warm, but that's shifting extremely fast. So this is the reality. So we can see here where we had this heat wave and drought. We had a drought for over 6 weeks, and you can really see from this satellite image from the European Space Station how it affected us. Okay, so what's really interesting is that on the south and the east of the country really went through this drought and was really affected badly, whereas on the west and northwest was completely different. Now, just by coincidence, my brother decided to get married that year in the July, so packed the kids in the car and we left London, which was 40 degrees, no rain, really, really hot. And we travelled through the night all the way up to the northwest, which is under the cloud, to an island called Canna, in the Inner Hebrides of Scotland, where, to give you an idea, it was 12 degrees and pouring with rain, and they had yet to see the sun. So that's how it's shifting and changing in the UK. And this is really what I wanted to do, was understand the consequence of this when we think of our woody plants. Now, this heat wave actually caused Kew to lose 460 trees out of its collection that year. So it's really significant impact to us. And we have 11,000 trees. So that's a big impact on our living collection. So we all know we're moving. So if we look at all the research, it's going to exceed 6 billion people by the 2050s will be in urban areas, and that's what makes Kew unique. We're part of an urban heat island. That's why the effects of drought are so significant for us, and that's why we see these really, really bad droughts coming in, because it's increased by these urban heat islands. So this is a map here of London as an urban heat island, and we can see here Kew is in that little red box, which has been highlighted there. And we can see that wiggly blue line that's going through the centre of the screen. That's the Thames. So in this heat map, we can see the River Thames and the water vapour and the cooling of that. Richmond Park, that's a lot higher. So it's got a bit of elevation there, but also the species composition. It is a very cool environment compared to the surrounding urban environment. And then if we look at Kew, we can see Kew there is mostly that light green, but however, to the north of the site, where we start having bigger lawns and less canopy cover, we can see that increase in temperature. Now, when we look at this model, we know there's a 2-degree difference across our site. So if we go to the southwest corner, where we're in that nice light green colour, it is approximately 2 degrees cooler than the north end of the site, where we can see a lot more of those orange blocks appearing. And that's because of grass. When we lose our grass here at Kew, The soil, because of our visitor numbers, which is approximately over 2 million a year, our soil is capped. Okay, so the effect of this soil compaction, that's the grass, once it dies through the drought and the heat wave, it then takes on the same properties of concrete. So it's absorbing heat all day and then it radiates it at night, really pushing our temperatures up. And that's what we start to see. And once we get to that point, Kew gets very hot, very dry, and that's when we start seeing lots of mortality. Now, this is also due to our soils. We've got really poor soils. It's not the best place to put a botanic garden. So really, when we look at our soils, we're on a free draining sand over gravel. So really, what we are is floodplain. And so we have very little water holding capacity of our soil, and our soils are very shallow. So the soil depth approximately across Kew is about 30 centimetres. So we have very little organic layer. So we have very little water holding capacity within our soil, which it also increases the issue. So to really start to understand this, we need to understand where we are today, but where we're going to go in the future. So this is done under an SSP 3.8. So this is the worst case scenario modeling. And then we really want to understand how we're going to see this shift. So if we think of Kew today, we're at 10.8 when we look at mean annual temperature. Now, where we see here in this graph in Bio 1, we're really going to shift through these climate scenarios. So as we go through these scenarios right up to 2090, we're going to increase to over 4 degrees. Now, we know that heat alone isn't always the issue, but what we do know is that heat will drive the water demand in trees. So as we get warmer and as this temperature increases, and we have a reduction in humidity because we're not getting the rainfall because we're going through these droughts, that really drives the water demand in the plant. So we have to understand the consequence of that. So we really have to understand our precipitation. Now, if we think about precipitation in this sense, is the input. This is the amount of input we're getting into our soils, which is a water availability for our plants. So if we look here, Kew, because of where it is in this urban heat island, it sits sort of in the centre of the south. It's buffered by a lot. So we don't get a lot of rainfall, which comes in predominantly from the west. So our rainfall was quite static. We see here in this model run that we're predicted to get 616 millimeters of precipitation. Now, to really understand the consequence of the heat and the precipitation, we have to understand our annual potential evapotranspiration, which is, we all know, that's the calculation of how much moisture is used through plant growth and vapor. So as we can see here, we shift really quick. So we go from 750 all the way up to 875. Now, if we think about rain interception, we think about soil capping, realistically, we would need over 950 to 1,000 millilitres of rainfall in order for us to balance out, okay? So if we think of our moisture like our bank account, currently we're spending more than what we're putting in. So we're always in the negative, okay? And that's real concern when we think about our plants and what plants we can grow. Because when we look at, especially our native flora in the UK, they've evolved to grow in an environment where they have excess, so they have more water availability in what they need. So therefore, they don't have these hydraulic capacities to deal with these really severe droughts and these heat waves that we're seeing become more common. So what I wanted to understand is how could we use this information in order to look at our woody plants? So what we then start to do is build these climate variables. So we had to understand climate variables and then how we can build these into species distribution modeling to help us do some predictions of the potential impact of climate change on our trees here at Kew. So to do that, as part of my research work at Lancaster University, I started doing lots of assessments of all the climate variables. So to do that, I looked at 52 climate variables. I then what sits behind this graph is millions of observation points of different species of trees. And then what I then looked at is what is the biggest driver in observation. Now, this is to help us to thin down. We can't use 52 climate variables in a model, but we also can't use variables that have too close a relationship, because if they have too close a relationship, we have an overfitting model. So everything is rather really good or everything's really bad. You need two opposites when we look at our variables in order to build the model. So from doing this work, what I managed to figure out was we needed to understand the drought. That's really what's driving these observations. So to do that, I look at things, climatic moisture index, and then we use mean annual temperature over the growing season. So what we are looking at is the potential of the length and intensity of drought. And this is a nice visual of how that calculation works. So really what we're looking at is how much rainfall we have come in and how much potential evapotranspiration we have through plant growth and evaporation from the soil, so we know how stressful these drought conditions have the potential to impact us. So what we can do then is then start looking at the speed of change. So if we look at this graph here, we can see here, this is tracking this drought periods and the frequency of drought over time. So if we look at naught there, so we look in the middle of the graph, when we're at 0, that's where everything is equal. So our potential evapotranspiration is equal to our precipitation. So that's where the world is equal. Now, as you can see, from 1981 to 2010, we had an environment where we had more resources, so we had more rainfall than what our plants required. So when we think about hydraulic capacity, these trees were growing. They didn't have to think about hydraulic capacity. So they don't have to think about how they're going to deal with drought because they had more resources than what they needed. So they're living in really comfortable life. Now, what we can see is from 2010 to 2020, these droughts are becoming more significant. So they're becoming in more frequently, they're longer in time, and they're more intense. Now, what we can then do by using the model, so using the worst case scenario models, we can see how the predictions are. So we can see this trend where these droughts are going to become more intense and increase in length. And that's really what we're seeing here. So we can now see that how the influence of climate is really shifting what our weather patterns do. What we tend to see and what we look at when we look at models, we're going to have a lot drier springs, really dry and warm summers, but we will have an increase in temperature and moisture in our autumns. Now, for us, especially with our native flora, they all rely on water early on in the season, especially species like oak that are ring porous. They rely on that early precipitation in order to put on sapwood growth in order to go into growth. Now, this year we had a spring drought, and that's really affected the amount of growth that the oaks have put on, and they're really starting to struggle. And we're starting to visibly see that now within dieback, within the canopy, within the arboretum. So now we know where we're going, we need to start to think about how we can use this data to start trying to understand our living landscapes. So what the next job was really was to use all these and trying to get all this information into a model so we can do some predictions. So what we do is we use species occurrence data. So we look at wild observations of plants. We then, once we have that observation, we then run that through environmental layers. So we pull in that environmental data for each one of those observation points. And then we can then use a model to look at how we can then start to predict the consequence and how these species are going to have the potential to react. And this was really the basis what was used within the living landscape, the landscape succession plan, what was published last year for Kew. And that's this document here. I expect many of you have seen this. This was a document that we released where we used this work to really start to understand the consequence on our tree collection. So from doing this work, we know that 50% of our plants are going to really struggle here in the landscape. That's mainly because of where we chose to collect from. Over the years, we've done a lot of plant collections in the wet Asia. So we've done Vietnam, Taiwan, Japan, Sichuan in China. So they're really humid environments. Now the plants, they live in this environment where there's so much moisture, they don't have to put any hydraulic capacity to deal with that stress. So we're really starting to see where we collected our plants from, how this is going to influence our landscape. And we can really see here that The outsider range is nearly 50% of our collection. So we really have to start thinking about how we mitigate this. So that could be we put those plants under intensive management. So we could irrigate them, although not very sustainable. That is a possible option. Or we have to look at what we do and look at where else we can collect plants from, or what species composition we represent here in the landscape, and really think about what plants our landscape can grow rather than what we want to grow. So this is really how it looks. So this is the impact of Kew. So we've got all those orange dots. They're the ones that are on the edge of the range that we think they're more likely to be potentially vulnerable. The red dots, we know those poor plants, they haven't really got they're not going to have the hydraulic capacity to deal with our predicted future. And then the green dots, they're the ones that we know that are well adapted, and 90% of their observations are currently growing in the wild in what our predicted future is. And that's really what we see here. So this is a good visualization of the impact on Kew. Now, what I then did was then start doing some research. So this was a paper that was published on looking at how we can look at our native flora and the potential consequence of that. So again, based on Kew's data set. So what we can see here, and this explains what's going on in the model in the background really well. So each one of these dots is an observation point plotted. So we've pulled in that data. We then pulled in their climate data. We then plotted it. We can then plot that change. So you can see for many of the species, when we were living in an environment where we had lots of rainfall and we weren't having these intense droughts, we're right in the center cluster of the observations of the species. But as you can see, as time changes and the influence of climate is now coming in, so the influence of climate change, we can now see that how this is shifting. And we can see by 2090 on a lot of the species, we're going to be on the very driest edge of those species and nearly outside the range for Betula pendula, for instance. So we have to understand what we could do if we would like to represent those species. Where could we look for them? So to do that, what we do, we can use things like Euclidean distance, which I built as part of my thesis. Now, this is really measuring space in time, so we can then really find the ideal environment or ecosystem to potentially go to that environment, collect plants where they have genetically adapted to have this plasticity to deal with these predicted drought that we're predicted to have. Now, this is how it works. So here we can see that by using this methodology, we can start to find areas. So by doing this, we split the globe up into 1 kilometer squares. We then pull in the climate data, and then by using Euclidean distance, we can then start to look at suitable sites where the trees are currently growing under our future conditions. Now we've run some plant collecting trips using this methodology, and now we've gone to those environments, one, to see how those trees are coping in that environment, so we can really see how they're performing in the landscape, but also to then collect seed to then start to understand how they adapted to grow in those environments when taxonomically they're the same species of what we have here at Kew and they're struggling. So from this information, we managed to build up this map. This map is built off this information where we can really start to look at key areas for Kew, so we can really understand where we need to go and collect and go and build our collection trips around, where we know that these plants are going to have the better tools to deal with our predicted future. And that's really what this is. So we've run some trips to Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Georgia and Romania, and we're currently building one up to go to Azerbaijan. And they're all areas that are highlighted on this map that we know through our research where the trees have the potential to have this plasticity to deal with our predicted future. Now, what we've now done is started to use plant traits as well. So we're using things like turgelos point of leaves, wood density and leaf dry matter content to start creating like a confidence score. So we know that these variables are known to be how we can assess how a species can adapt to drought. And here's some papers that I was part of where we looked at this work and we did the research into these variables and why they're key indicators when we start looking at species plasticity and the species ability to adapt in a drought. And these are the papers that really guided this work moving forward and start using plant traits as well as models. Then in this one, we did an evaluation of how the model worked against some of these plant traits, and we found that the models predicting are probably about 93% accuracy by testing these traits against the model outputs. And that was done in this paper here using turgor loss point, which was published in September, so very new publication. Now, this is great in botanic gardens, but what we really wanted to do was test this in the big bad world. So what we did for that is we then was given the opportunity to really look at this under assessing the public realm trees of London, and that's really been a really exciting project. 11 months of hard work, but it's now published, and we can start to see how these results can be used in an urban context and not just in a botanic garden. So if we look here under this report, we can see what we did is we used the species distribution modeling, but we also used the plant traits to then give it a confidence score. So if we have all the data sets, we would then give it a high suitability, but it would have a high confidence. If we don't have all the data sets, so we had species distribution modeling and wood density, we would give that again a high suitability, but it would have a low confidence score. And that's really how we built this report. Now, the results of this have been quite alarming. Really interesting for me that looks into urban plants and urban trees, but it's really been really eye-opening how we can use science and really use data to start using an analytical process to understand what trees we should be planting or what trees could be at risk. So really, this is the result of it. So you can see here that over 62% of those trees planted in the urban environment in London have a low suitability to the predicted future by using the models and the functional traits in order to do that assessment. And then we can see that just over 10% are vulnerable. And what's really scary is that 0.3, well, 0.38% are suitable species. So, it has been really interesting to build this up. But what's great, we can now use this information to start building more resilient planting palettes depending on the city. So depending on their predicted climate and the growing conditions, we can now start looking at how we can build these plant compositions so we can now get diversity in, but also some resilience when we think of climate. And this is really what the work we've been working on. So this is all the species that we now know through doing all this research have the potential to be suitable species to grow in London. So this is something that's now been published. It was published on Monday, so this is very new and hot off the press. So this is the report now. So these are our recommendations on what species that we could look at for some replacements of some of the trees that are going to be vulnerable into the future. And it's really important that we don't just plant species diversity, we really have to start thinking about our genetic diversity as well. And that's something we're now trying to work with the commercial trade to build that in, to start building in this more diversity so we can create more resilient landscapes into the future. Something that we are starting to work on is the pest and disease element. So this is just looking at climate and plant and drought stress. We're now starting to work on projects where we can use this methodology to now start to build in, hopefully, diseases and the potential for diseases in model to start modeling the potential impact is that as well. So we can then start to use big data to really start to do these big assessments on our treescapes in our urban environments. And that is a quick whiz through of the work that I've been up to. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. That was brilliant and fascinating. There's a question that was already dropped into chat from Christy Rollinson in Morton Arboretum about the PCA. How did you decide what species to use to do the initial PCA? Were the species already at Kew or were they regionally important?
I used the species that we had represented in the Arboretum. So it was a real big mix of different species to build that PCA, but it was all done on what we had here in the Arboretum to
All
build the
right.
PCA.
If anybody has any questions for Kevin, feel free to come off mute, or you can drop it into chat as well. A quick one I've just got, just for some context. Melbourne Gardens is not nearly as large as Kew in terms of the footprint, so our entire site is irrigated. You have areas of your site, I'm supposing, that are the beds that are irrigated, but the larger arboretum type portions aren't. Is that right?
Yeah, so we do have irrigation. We do have irrigation points, but the problem is we don't have any rainwater harvesting. So
Mm.
any irrigation we do pull comes in from the mains, it's drinking water. So we're
Ah,
working on a
yes.
big project now, trying to understand one, how we can change our planting, but also how we can use storage like lakes and some of the rainwater harvesting tanks to try and store water. So we're trying to work out for our irrigation project how much irrigation we need, and then from
Mm.
that we can then look at how we plant our landscape into the future.
Yeah, that'll be a massive endeavor, I can imagine.
Yeah, it's a nightmare. It's trying to understand everything because everyone like we all want to carry on representing the plants we know and love, and that's not always going to be possible. So I think it's
Mm.
the cultural shift and change which is going to be difficult.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine. Speaking as somebody who adores conifers, and Melbourne has not been a place for many conifers for many, many, many decades now. I understand the pain of sort of having to let some of your darlings go, as it were. But
Yeah.
it does mean that it sounds like there are a lot of new species that will be more open to you now, which I think would be very exciting.
Oh, that's how I look at it. That's what I'm excited about. It's the new species, especially going into Central Asia. Yeah, that's what you've got to look at the positives, but we'll be able to represent some really interesting stuff into the future.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned that you'd been to, oh, apologies to everyone else. It's nearly 4 in the morning for me, so I'm a bit scatty. You mentioned you went to Romania and a few other places already.
Yeah, so we've been to Romania. Personally, I've been to Romania and Georgia, but we've also had trips to go to Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan.
Oh, fantastic. So, was there any sort of surprising discoveries there or insights that you took away just from seeing these trees in their
Ah,
habitat, in their climate?
yeah, lots. What you see is plant competition on the edge of its
Mm.
range, and you can see species adaptability. So when you're on the edge of the range, so you're going into the driest forest, steppe forest, what you will see is the species competition. You will see how uh, the woods look like they've been planted in blocks, and it's not. They're natural forests, they're reserves. And what happens is, for instance, on a slope, as the slope starts to dry out, you will see a species which is more competitive and better adapted to that drought will outcompete its neighbour. And it's the most fascinating thing to go and see. So when you're there, you can really see which species have this ability to adapt, so they can keep growing there and outcompete their neighbour, which is the most fascinating thing to go and see.
Yes, brilliant. I've got a couple more questions from Morton. From Spencer, wanted to hear more about the impact of oak dieback and the spring droughts.
Yeah, so what we see, especially with our oaks here, especially with our native, our Quercus robur, they, what we're starting to see, due to having more rainfall and warmer autumns, they are holding on to their leaves a lot longer and they're still growing really late into the season. So some of the oaks have only just started to go into autumn mode now, and we're in December. Now, this is becoming a common theme. Now, those oaks have evolved to always go into dormancy to break the sugars down in order to go into dormancy period from let's October, November, end of October, beginning of November, but they're now still growing quite later on in the season. By February, they then have to then start the building blocks again to then produce energy to then put on the sapwood to go into bud burst. What we're starting to see, because we had a spring drought, so from the 31st of January to the 1st of September, I only had 25 centimeters of rainfall for the whole spring and summer, which is extremely low. Now, what we know that because oaks have really big vessels because of being ring porous. So in the sapwood, they have really big vessels. So because they have really big vessels, they're really sensitive to cavitation early on in the season. And that's what drought stress causes. So if we don't have that water, you get cavitation. So what that then does is that vessel then dies. So then that sapwood isn't as active. It's not providing enough resources to the canopy. And what we're starting to see is lots of tip dieback, a lot, and we're seeing canopy thin, and we're seeing the production of dead wood. So what I have here at Kew at the moment, I've got 6 dendrometers out measuring growth here on the oak tree, on 6 oak trees here at Kew, and I've also got dendrometers on some sister oaks in our garden out in the country in Wakehurst, and I'm measuring the comparison at the moment. So hopefully by the end of this winter, I will have 2 years worth of data to look at to see how it's really affecting the growth patterns on those oaks. And that's what we're looking at, because it is we're starting to lose them out there. So this year, for instance, the team they've got to remove 4 trees, and they're all oaks, all English oaks, so Quercus robur. So it's now really starting to impact us a lot more.
Yeah, no, that awful, but also a brilliant way of also looking at it as well. As I said, Melbourne's irrigated, but we have, so the spring drought isn't so much an issue for us, even if we're not getting the precipitation. But just anecdotally, over this winter, there were several of our large, very mature oak species on our oak lawn that never actually lost all their leaves at all. It was the new buds coming through that pushed the dead leaves out, and that's been sort of the growing pattern of the last few years. They're not going properly dormant and dropping all their leaves as it is. Christy's got a couple more great questions. Talk a bit more about the climate change data you were using in your modeling. Were you able to get from, oh my God, sorry, I can't read. Where were you able to get the Thornwave CMI from? Did you have to think about spatial resolution in your data sets?
Yeah, so spatial resolution is really important. So it's all done in 30 arc, which is really refined data. And that we download from big data sets. And yeah, so that because we're working in 30 arc, that's where we can get the refined resolution, and that's how we bring the data in. And that's really why when you're building these data sets, you have to think about what once you identify those climate variables, how you use those variables and at what resolution. So some models you can download will be at 5 arc, which isn't refined enough. You won't pick up that accuracy. When you're working in 30 arc, it's approximately one kilometer square, so we can bring in that refinement, and that's what was really important. And that's how we did it. So, and that's why we can build those maps like we can, because we've got that area of accuracy.
Continuing on with the climate data, how much are you relying on the black box style trait data from Try, etc., where you get what you can get versus are acquiring trait data specifically from Kew? What do you do or recommend doing for plants where trait data isn't available?
Really difficult. That's the biggest problem we've got. So what we do is we use Try dataset when we've got gaps in our own data. And that's really where we need the research money now, is to then fund further trait analysis in different plant species, and that's really where it relies on. It needs a lot of research. We're very fortunate. We've in our data sets that we've done is myself, Henrik Quellman, Andy Hirons, and Harry Watkins. We've all worked together over the last decade, and we've done most of the species available in the trade. So we've got them, and which is really good. So that's been great, and we can use that. But what we need now is to do more work in arboretums like Kew to collect more data and try and fill those gaps that are on Try. And that's pretty much where hopefully, if I can get some funding, the PhD goes to, is to do a lot more trait analysis.
It's always the issue, isn't it? Research leads to more research.
Yeah.
We constantly need more data.
You do.
From
Yeah.
the
There's
Central
never
Park
enough.
Conservancy, can you talk about how this model approach might evaluate successive plantings in place, for example, another tree planting in the same location over time?
Yeah, so really what we can do is then look at what we can do, several things. We can use this information to look at what would be better suited in that spot, and that what that plant's plasticity is, but also we can use like the Euclidean distance to look at where we could source material from. So, you know, for us in Botanic Gardens, it's a lot easier because we do plant collections, but I'm really working with commercial nurseries now for them to start to understand where they need to start looking to source new material. If we look at our commercial nurseries, they have a very small genetic diversity of their plants. A lot of them are clones, and they've all been passed around the nursery trade. And a lot of those plants would have come in from the early Victorian plant collections. So what we now need to do is now build in this genetic diversity by looking at where it's appropriate for certain regions around the world where commercial nurseries should be looking in order to source material. But what I've done with some landscape architects now is start looking at planting palettes and building up those planting palettes by using this information so we can see how species can react and how they have the ability to have the plasticity to deal with our predicted future. But what's also great, you can identify those plants. If they're important to your landscape, you can put a management plan in. You can do some mulching, you can do some irrigation. You know, it's just highlighting those trees that are going to have that potential to be at risk because they don't have that hydraulic capacity to deal with the predicted future.
Yeah, so do you this is probably like the context of the country, or possibly just Kew having that incredible reputation. You have a relationship with commercial nurseries in the UK that you can actually engage in this conversation.
I've built that relationship over the last 2 years,
Oh, well
and that's
done.
so that is where I am at the moment. I'm having lots of different meetings. I've got meetings with central government as well, but we've also had lots of meetings with different commercial nurseries, trying to get them to understand why it's going to be so important into the future, and that is
Mm,
probably been the biggest thing is trying to work collaboratively with commercial nurseries, and that's
mm.
really what the work is now over the next couple of years is really trying to get this work so it's thought about in the commercial nurseries.
Yeah, and you mentioned you were also meeting with central government, so say
Yeah.
local councils for street trees and urban planning and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, so like the London report, that's done 1.2 million trees in London that are all
Mm,
owned by the local authorities. So we've done that report, but also I'm having discussions with DEFRA, which is in charge of our environment, the government department in charge of our environment here in the UK, and I've also provided expert witness evidence in chambers in Parliament on this work the environmental committee. So we are now starting to get government to listen a bit more, and that this is something needs addressing. We can't ignore it for any longer.
fantastic. That's incredible outreach and so very important as well. Question here from Kevin Kubrick. The modeling relies on taking a single species and looking at the reaction in it due to a change in climate. Is that too simplified to expand to a group of plants? This is a bit of a Susan Simard question. Do groups of plants better behave and adapt differently? Is this more of a concern in natural populations rather than artificial ones like a botanic garden? Hmm.
Trying to think how I can answer that one. So what we do is we're not just we look at all, like within my data set, I've got 58,000 species of trees that we look at in the wild environment, but also in the urban environment. Now, what we're looking at is how that species, what the model does. It looks at the site and it looks at its predicted future. It then looks at the observation data, and then it looks at how much percentage of those observations grow within your predicted future. So by doing that, you can then, if for instance, 90% of the species observations live or occur, should I say, in your predicted future, that plant would have the ability to adapt to that environment that you're predicted to have. Now, if you then start looking at a species, and let's say 75% of the observations are in the dry's observations of the species, you know that that's going to be more at risk, and you'd have to start looking at where you source the material from. Now, what was interesting with Thornwake's work was this was used originally until the calculation was updated in the early 2000s. It was originally looked at for agricultural crops and where agricultural crops should be used around the world. So this is a methodology that's been used in agriculture. It's just never been used and implemented like this when we look at ornamental plants. So this sort of work's always been used to look at threat levels in different tree species when we look at climate change. So the methodology is used in other industries and research like functional ecology, but this is the first time we've really been able to use it into an ornamental horticultural focal point. It's also been used in forestry to look at timber trees. It's been used a lot within that to look at future timber trees.
Excellent. Another one from Spencer at Morton, which is, what recommendations or lessons learned would you have for other botanic gardens who aspire to repeat this process for their site or local urban area?
Oh, got plant names. The biggest thing I've learned is the plant names, making sure you have a standard taxonomic backbone to what plant is called what. So obviously we use Kew's Plants of the World Online, which is one of the international naming authorities for this model, and you wouldn't believe the different names used for one species. When we did the London project, where we looked at those million trees, there was, I would hate to think how many weeks we spent data cleaning and creating a standard structure of naming, and that's probably the thing. Make sure your naming is sorted before you even start, because it's a
I will,
nightmare.
yeah, I will second that. We're doing some work right now to develop the climate assessment tool version 2. And as is the same with version 1, just taxonomy and synonyms in particular
Yeah,
are incredibly complicated tricks and beasties, and sometimes you do just have to get in by hand and go dit 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 on the
yeah,
database,
yeah, yeah.
which adds up.
It does. I reckon we did the London data set. What we've got, 270 different species, 1.2 million trees. I think it took us nearly 6 weeks to get sorted.
Oh my gosh.
Because you're relying on tree officers looking at that plant and giving it a name as well. So that's the other thing is, it's you're dealing with data. We all know the problems when we're dealing with data. Data's data. It's great when it's clean and it works, but when it's messy, it doesn't communicate to each other. It's very
Yeah, it's
difficult.
never that clean.
No, it's not.
Um, we are coming up just to the end here. I'm going to dive in with just one more question myself. Uh, it's a fair shift in climate that you are facing over the next sort of 50 years sort of thing. The types of trees that you are seeing out on your collecting trips, do you see that affecting the landscape character of Kew, being as the landscape character can be
Yeah,
incredibly important for so many of the older gardens, such as yourself, us, Morton, I think as well. Yeah.
it's so important. It's like sense of place, and
Mm-hmm.
that's probably going to be our biggest thing. And that's really where we have to be really thoughtful when we plant our landscape, from plants that we know are going to be vulnerable to what we're going to put back there. They're going to have to be structurally very similar. So beech is
Mm.
a good one, right? So within the UK, especially in the southeast, the common beech, Fagus sylvatica, is used a lot, especially in our heritage landscape. Now, to lose that is a big structural plant within your landscape to lose. So what we've done is that end slide, my thank you slide, is actually a naturally occurring hybrid of the common beech Fagus sylvatica across the oriental beech Fagus orientalis. Now, it's hybridized in the wild and it's called Fagus crostorica, and that from an untrained eye looks like common beech. So they're the sort of ones that we're looking at here. So we collected that in Romania. I've got 100 grown here now in the Arboretum nursery, because that's what I will look at to replace those trees. So that's the work that we're now doing, is trying to find similar species so we don't lose that character of landscape.
Yeah. I guess related to that, I will close up quickly, is just landscape character being so very much tied to public perception as well. It's
Yeah.
You need to tread that path carefully and make sure you bring the public along with you so that they understand why you're doing what you're doing to a place that they know and love very much.
To be fair, that's the most interesting thing now, is the cultural change. And the public engagement about cultural change. Like, I always use the scenario here at Kew, and I do a lot of public outreach speaking about the Great British Garden, which actually is mainly from Japan, because we got magnolias, camellias, cherries, and Japanese maples. And I was like, you've got to remember, those plants come from really wet, moist environments, which we're shifting away from. We see that already. So they're the plants that we have to think about in our personal gardens. And it's not like all our planting palettes were dictated to us by those Victorian plant hunters, because they went for wonder and beauty and curiosity. It's like we have to now shift our mindset to a bit more of a resilient palette rather than the big show-off plants.
I think you can have a lot of wonder and beauty in smaller, stubbier things.
Yeah, I
as it
do,
were.
because I love the steps, so I'm going to say that. I'm biased.
Brilliant. All right. I don't see any more questions, so we might tie this up now. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Would you be able to shoot me a link to, I think I found 3 of the papers that you mentioned. I think I missed one, but any link to that?
If you go on my ResearchNet page, they're all ResearchGate page. They're all on there.
Oh, fantastic. I'll make sure to include that when I send an email out about the recording going out. Thank you, everyone who took the time out of your day to come and sit in with this and ask questions and take care. This was the last one for the year, so hopefully you'll go up in the northern hemisphere, you're going into winter. Hopefully you're getting a good amount of rain. Your winter is treating you gently. And yeah, again, thank you so much, everybody, for coming.